Isabel, how are you?
Hello, Lucia. I'm very well. Thank you. Here in Berlin, in my studio.
Great. I'm very happy to be having this conversation with you. And obviously it picks up on a lot of things that we discussed over the last few weeks as well. So.
Yes, same. Looking forward. This format is new for me. I feel like, you and I have had several conversations in the past that just kind of feel really natural. But of course, when we're recording, it's a whole nother feeling. And I think that's also interesting to maybe acknowledge in terms of that like the sensory experience of what we're doing, that there is one even on this digitized platform.
Absolutely true. It's true. And even like already a few months ago, we may have begun to get used to the experience of having like a one-to-one kind of intimacy, even at a remove, and then the experience of speaking in public at a remove. And this is 3 times removed because we're obviously pre-recording. So, so like
here
the
we are.
energy that bodies give you,
Yes.
like in space, we don't.
Yeah. In that whole complicated and interesting mess of embodiment and its multiple mediations. Here we go.
Yeah, here we go. Well, let's start from let's ease in then and start from just my asking you to introduce a little bit your practice and also the kind of adjacent and inspirational practices and research fields that you look to in your research at the moment.
Yeah, sure. So, my foundation, the foundation of my practice is dance. That's sort of where it all begins for me, is studying classical ballet is actually kind of where it begins, like to form itself as a more kind of intellectual and sort of serious pursuit. But of course, dance was always a part of my life. As a Dominican American child, growing up in a Dominican family, you learn to dance right away. So that kind of experiential level of communicating through the body and the sensation involved with that, I think remains a foundation of my practice. And it grows outward from there in a way which maybe doesn't seem too obvious to most people. But when you actually engage with the practice of what it is to dance, it opens up a lot of alternative ways of thinking about being in the world. And I think those kinds of openings are what sort of led me towards contemporary art, towards architecture, towards music, towards sound design, and sort of starting to engage with collaborators in different fields from mine, which I would say this also forms a major part of my practice of dance and collaborations across different disciplines with people like Cecil Tolas, with who I have a long-standing collaboration with composers and sound designers, labor, and many others. So some from the field of academics, some from the field of design. And I think that the way that I bring these things together is in kind of creating immersive experiences, installations, dances. In my point of view, they're dances. They really are choreographies or compositions of the works that I create now as these kind of immersive installations, we could say, but I hesitate to use that word because it seems to suggest the primacy of the visual, and that's exactly what I actually try to counteract in my practice by addressing all of the senses in these performances.
Mm-hmm. And if you had to situate, first of all, I really like the fact that you referred to collaboration as kind of a medium. Like working in the medium of dance and collaboration, it seems to me like a really interesting way of, and need to think a little bit about that. But where would you situate your sort of most intense kind of point of research and passion, like that you're at right now?
Yeah, at the moment, I'm really diving deep into actually the history of medicine and the history of the body itself. So, in some ways, I've my entire professional career and long before that been sort of interrogating like what it means, what embodiment means at all, and sort of what the experience of it and the intellectual experience, the phenomenology of being embodied. But this is kind of the first time that I'm actually really digging into looking at the different stories that we've told ourselves as inhabitants of the West, about how we sort of formed our ideas about the body as we know it now, and what we could call the sort of like object body, or the idea of the body as something that can be like sort of cut open and opened up and organs taken out, and sort of how it functions in an almost mechanistic sort of way, and looking also to prior histories of that way of thinking about the body, and particularly at the moment looking at the humoralist body. So when the moment in the history of the West where we thought about the body as being ruled by these four humors that were very much affected, even sort of violently so, by its environment. So an idea of the body that was much more porous and much more contingent and affected, which we kind of are really experiencing that as a reality and not as a metaphor right now.
And so in that sense, looking at the body as something that has a history that's cited in maybe the history of medicine, or some kind of cultural and historical memory, also positions the body as something that is also constructed by a set of ideologies and kind of subject positions, no?
Absolutely. I think that the way that I feel like, you know, sort of as you sort of been looking at sort of the history of the body and how the body is sort of referred to and dealt with in our culture, to me, it's almost very clear to see a fear of the body, even like a hatred of the body. It's always something that's sort of errant, or it sort of needs governing, and it's like moral depravity is always kind of being sort of brought up again and again, sort of through literature and through different expressions, through different cultural expressions. So that how do we sort of arrive to that way of approaching the body? And to me, that very let's say the fear of the body and the bodily and the potential like messiness of that is something that is so clearly constantly sort of being repressed in our culture, or like the attempt to control it is so urgent somehow, or seems to be so urgent, and is embedded, I would say, in almost every aspect of our society.
Well, it seems, I mean, what I'm hearing is also these two histories of constructions that kind of like, how do you say, kind of gravitate around each other and exist with each other. Because on the one hand, you have this history of the body to be, I suppose Foucault would say, disciplined and in some way repressed or held or sort of defined and boundaried. And on the other, the body as also something that exists in the quantifiable language of extraction, whether it's extraction of labor, extraction of value and capital, or extraction of also, like, you know, I'm thinking like life insurance enters that realm of kind of extraction and quantification. And I was really shocked, actually. And you're sort of, I also was shocked by being shocked about the fact that I had been shocked by the fact that there are some very specific ways of calculating the worth of a life. I mean, we know that in history that has been done time and time again, but that insurance companies have a way of quantifying the worth of a life to the person who's living it themselves by thinking about their willingness to take risk. And so there's a whole kind of risk. So all of these that are positioned often as like historical are not inevitably. They kind of exist in these like underlays of the body. And it's funny, I mean, you just mentioned the body and we've already got this kind of it goes very quick to run from one thing.
Yes, because it is, as you mentioned, kind of so deep and so layered, and it's sort of, we have also even the notion of the kind of body as a unit, as a kind of individualized unit itself has a history, and there are other ways of also thinking about it, also from other fields, which kind of touches on one of your earlier questions, like what am I kind of looking at? What are the adjacent practices that are kind of inspiring me at the moment? And it's from, the sociology of epigenetics to like anthropology beyond humans with Eduardo Cohn's How Forests Think, to like evolutionary biology, especially Dr. Lynn Margulis, I think that's how you say her last name, with her kind of emphasis on symbiosis and cooperation as a source of like evolutionary innovation, actually, and her emphasis on that rather than competition, and the notions of sort of competition or survival of the fittest. So these are the kind of, when you start digging into your sort of panning across sort of other fields and trying to sort of piece together like that which forms the ideologies with which we inhabit our bodies and thereby sort of like shape and construct the world around us, it gets very, it's just major. I feel like I'm kind of have been in this process of research sort of for my own kind of bodily experimentation with dance, but I feel like it's a lifetime of research more to even like piece together the question, sort of the epistemological range of it is kind of massive.
I really hope that we return to this later on in the conversation, because there's just so much there in terms of like decentering the human, like who is this human that's being decentered in a post-anthropocentric perspective and all of that. So you proposed the I suppose title for this conversation to be Sensory Studies for Social Innovation, and being that it's a title that's full of things that we could individually kind of go into, zoom into a little bit, I thought that we could just pick it apart and unpack a little bit all the things that are inside that. So you've already mentioned it earlier on about a kind of not so much experience, but an analysis that you have, and with which I completely agree, of the contemporary world being based primarily on visual form and on quantitative, I suppose, analyses or quantitative methods. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that, and in terms of maybe examples throughout fields, or how this is, I suppose, embodied and perceived in daily life.
Yeah, sure. For me, there's it was very interesting for me to kind of dig into historically sort of what is pre-Enlightenment understandings of the world. And there's one great book by Jan Culiano called Eros and Magic in the Renaissance, where he talks about this kind of unmitigated unilateral shift from sort of qualitative understandings of the world to quantitative understandings of the world, sort of through this kind of massive development and the rise of Puritanism, capitalism, and the scientific worldview. This kind of qualitative world that he discusses is sort of hard for, as a kind of person raised in this era, it's very difficult to sort of even fully grasp the ways in which he's talking about things like magic, certain like technologies of the self, like the art of memory, and how it interrelated with Eros and a particular understanding of cosmology. It's really hard to wrap one's like kind of modern head around these things, but I guess one has to sort of feel into them. But this shift to the sort of the quantifiable is very, very felt in my body, and I feel like that this is something that we encounter this every day. It sort of makes also everything sort of possible, how we operate, even the digital media that we interact with. So it's kind of a massive development, let's say, this sort of the quantification of everything. My interest would not be in sort of like retroactively sort of taking that away from us, but rather sort of what acknowledging sort of what goes missing, or what is there a way that still, as sort of contemporary humans living in this part of the world, can we connect to something of the qualitative modes of understanding. And there really have been, well articulated forms of being in relation with our world differently, beyond the sort of limitations of the quantifiable. And these, there's kind of various directions and sort of practices, I think, that actually highlight and could engage that. And in that sense, I think of sort of indigenous worldviews, other non-Western worldviews, many of which have this other kind of qualitative relations still sort of active and articulated. For us in the West, everything that seems, anything when we talk about these kind of things, it feels new agey, or it feels there's a kind of something awkward. It feels awkward. It seems like, okay, we're talking about energies or vibes, and nonetheless, these are very real, concrete things that I feel like are the actually more the material of my everyday than sort of the quantifiable, concrete sort of units of reality. Where were we? I'm sort of like going off on a tailspin.
No, not at all. It's so fair, because at the same time, I kind of also feel like maybe so much the humanities, but more the creative. I mean, I'm using that word a little bit carefully, but art forms have been kind of, or let's say art, poetry, myth, religion, magic, have existed and have been existing within this kind of qualitative space, but have been, I guess, divorced from what is considered to be like practical, scientific, useful, accurate, ontologically verifiable. And so in a way, there's like something in the medium itself that holds this almost secret in the contemporary world, no?
Yes, it's as though there's some kind of there's been, I mean, I've heard also these kind of, what is it, the hard knowledge and soft knowledge, or whatever, these kind of bizarre distinctions that we make, that sort of put kinds of knowledge in these hierarchical relationships to one another. But that again is yet another sort of symptom of kind of bureaucratic existence of like needing to quantify everything in order to systematize it and sort of have the kind of economy we have and have the kind of institutions that we have. And there's something very effective and like sort of, you can organize it and sort of produce and generate like ideas of value around it. So there's kind of all of these sort of functional aspects of it. Nonetheless, as you say, sort of in these other forms, like in whether it's in art and poetry and literature, we have maintained that space, but there's this kind of idea that the qualitative knowledge somehow holds less currency, somehow maybe currency is not the word, but sort of is taken less seriously. Which I guess to sort of bring me towards this sort of sensory studies, I think that there's a very distinct history of sort of visual culture and the way that supports and goes with and is intertwined with the kind of quantitative ways of understanding the world, the scientific worldview. What happens when we overuse this one sense, the visual, as like the visual beyond like actually what is happening physiologically with the eye, which is like very embodied and very like, physical in a concrete sense, and it becomes sort of abstracted in that like notion of sort of objectively being able to look and see, and how that kind of divorces us from a sense of embodied being, actually. I think that there is something to trying to rehabilitate the other senses, to sort of bring the power of the visual into a kind of check, into kind of like balance with that, like sort of all that we interact with, all of the digital formats we interact with. We for me, overemphasized the visual to an extent that I think we also tend to its atrophies. Sort of the other senses seem sort of almost dulled by the power of the visual. And that there for me is some kind of key or some kind of potential, let's say, in this rehabilitation of the senses, the unifying of a human sensorium, that for me suggests some kind of innovative liberatory potential.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, as I was thinking about the sort of overarching framing for the series, the artist as consultant, I was thinking, oh, there's some practical kind of advice that is already coming out of this. One of them, back to the quantitative, maybe something along the lines of, like, given the fact that art organizations, or that organizations that also support the mediums that still exist within the qualitative, have some obligations to transform that into quantitative impact assessment, then one of the kind of big to-dos is for those organizations and artists to continue to develop like qualitative impact assessment methodologies, and kind of oppose the or not oppose, but paint a fuller picture.
Yeah.
But those methods are kind of in progress. They exist, and there's lots of really, great work being done. But so that I would put that as like point one advice, like practical advice within this.
Yeah.
And then as far as the visual is concerned, I mean, one of the biggest, obviously, challenges that might come to mind in a moment like this. I mean, I'm not sure what you've been doing for the whole day. Over there, I've been in front of this computer doing much the same thing that I'm doing with you now, just not recorded. And so I think one of the effects of this hypertrophy of the visual medium is that being placed in a position of enclosure, say within a pandemic context, this medium here was the only option that seemed immediately available to us, whereas I'm sure that's not the case. And maybe one of the the question that would lead on from that would be, given your formation and the way that you work, I'm making a lot of assumptions here, but I'm assuming that your experience of, the slowdown, the lockdown, the kind of have been also different. And what have been your sensory, bodily experiences and modes of coping, in a sense, that you've had yourself?
Yeah. Really interesting. I mean, on to start maybe with this format of the digitally mediated through screens thing, I did actually develop a workshop that sort of had to do with looking at sort of the materiality of these objects that we're actually kind of standing and sitting and looking into constantly, and sort of actually sort of engaging in a practice of just hyper attention to not only looking through the screen as I project myself abstractly into space in order to meet you there in the digital realm, but to actually look at the surface of my cracked phone and the smudges on the screen, and the way that the guard is sort of placed just off center, and sort of really kind of not taking anything for granted in terms of zooming in on actually details. So using the eyes actually as a channel to further to sort of open up a deeper sense of my own embodiment. So not only using the eyes to project into sort of abstract space and sort of help me to think abstract concepts, but using the eyes in this very concrete way that sort of actually then opens up all of the sensory awareness into sort of presence, I would say. And I think that this little kind of exercise is something I've been kind of applying to everything, sort of my neighborhood here in Bedding, to outside in Brandenburg, where I spend time with my partner, an hour outside of Berlin, and sort of looking at the native grasses there, and like just really paying attention. So by looking becoming something more than a visual thing, it's something more like paying attention, actually. And that's been really radical for me, because I'm used to a kind of, the last years, I've become very accustomed to a kind of constant travel life of like being in one place with my body, projecting myself somewhere else to the where that body then arrives and then leaves again, and is sort of being in almost a nowhere state, a non-space, hovering kind of existence. And in this period, I've been in Berlin, the place where I've lived for 10 years, but never paid attention to as fully as I have, I think, in the last couple of months.
And how does that, I mean, going back to something that you said earlier, how does that, I don't know if there is a linguistic way of saying how necessarily, but in what way does that connect you with this kind of more than human being together?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There's something that again, it's more of an intuition than anything, but I sort of have the sensation also, aside from intuition, maybe a physical sensation that when engaged in that kind of presence, sort of awakened by paying attention, actually listening to my environment, this process of like attunement, whatever happens in that, like, and I think there's many practices that people also use for that kind of attunement, to presence, basically, to being sort of awakened to presence. I think in that kind of state, there's more of like a possibility or a potential to be sort of cognizant of the ways in which we're intertwined. So it's not that we just are. I don't believe that like we are not individuals, and we are holobionts composed of all these like different organisms all the time, but sort of being consciously awakened to that inside of like our constructed worlds where we're kind of made to operate as these individual units. I think that tuning in, that cultivating a capacity to be sort of responsive to all the kind of life and non-life that we're constantly actually intertwined with and engaged with. So that for me, there's some kind of link. By using our actually innate human capacities, we can bring ourselves into kind of more cognizant, aware, awakened sense of actually how truly interconnected we are, and not as metaphor, as just concrete. It's just that we sort of edit out a lot of information all the time, and probably for good reasons. It makes us efficient. Maybe that's not a good reason. It makes us maybe more productive to tune out all that information, all that micro information that's going on.
Well, it would also go some way towards explaining why there are so many practices, body-based practices, from like fasting to exercise to psychedelics. Yeah. And they're known as psychedelics in a particularly northwestern context, but obviously they're like intimate part, incredibly like important political and spiritual rituals as well elsewhere. It would go somewhere towards explaining why those things dislodge the habits of mind enough for that attention to be able to be like brought back, so that it's you kind of realize that it's always in there, but it's just not, I don't know, acknowledged or referred to or tapped into, or maybe that we don't have the exercise of being practiced to do it like a muscle.
Right, and I think that is kind of what it is. It's sort of it's there. It's just that sort of the metaphysics that kind of explain our existence or help us understand our existence are shaped in such a particular way. When I refer to sort of Western ideologies, Western thought, that supports that feeling of that disembodiment, that alienated. Like it kind of supports the idea of human as sort of individual and alienated from communion, actually, with all that is. that's sort of how we've been educated to believe is the nature of reality. And I think, yeah, all of these kinds of experiences, like the ones also you mentioned, like that dislodging, it kind of opens up, whatever that experience is of being high, whether it's on exercise or drugs or anything else, is also a kind of an altered form of attention, an altered form of attunement, perhaps, to the way we experience our reality.
I forgot childbirth in that list, but it definitely... It's certainly an experience of like strangeness, but also like that's very laced with like an altered state of mind that is very useful. I wanted to touch a little bit on like the you use the term liberatory, maybe. So like the political, the emancipatory, the liberatory potential of this kind of more than human and relational and sensory led position. On the one hand, when we were exchanging notes towards this conversation, some of the things that you mentioned brought to mind a conversation that I recently had with the artist Elaine Gann, who has collaborated with Anna Thing a few times and really has sort of shares methodologies with her. And she said, by taking the rice seriously, and I loved that expression to kind of, and what she did was by taking the rice seriously and really looking at its life cycles and growth cycles and the scales and the interspecies relations that it has with other, insects and plants and beings. It also unlocked the whole stack of like ecological, economic, political, etc. kind of interrelations that kind of literally meet in this tiny grain of rice. And so on the one hand, there's like, if you take the material seriously and you really follow it like a detective, you find all the stuff. On the other, there's obviously the fact that, and we go back to this, like the anthropocentrism, the Anthropocene, exists in a particular moment in time that is the same moment in time as the Industrial Revolution, obviously, and also colonialism, the development of financial institutions, coercive labor, like all of it happens in the exact same sort of spot. And, the holders of botanical knowledge in Europe were burned at the stake as witches. Indigenous traditions have basically undergone like mass genocide the world round and so on. And so by looking at the anthropocentrism as something that actually represents only a very small and very violently guarded category of humans. And the reason why I'm asking you this overly long question is because oftentimes practices of meditation or altered state of mind have had a reputation of being, as you said, new agey, but also somewhat apolitical. And I kind of wanted to get there because I think it's very important at a time in which we're kind of called upon to have political positions to sort of figure out together why is it that urgency is felt there. Why that is a political, to you particularly, where do you feel the politics of it as well?
Yeah, no, it's so interesting because I think that when we start, for me, like to firstly understand sort of how we construct our idea of the body, and then how that body is, how the conception of that body maybe contributes to the ways in which it's repressed or exploited or enslaved, etc., is very essential to sort of like understanding what like sort of structural like potential for any kind of like structural change, in my opinion. So for me, it's sort of like that like kind of trying to generate like a vision of a human future that already kind of takes a step sort of beyond even this mind-body split, is key to sort of like really enacting change. And that is a sort of a complex thing that sort of laced through the foundations, the very foundations of our culture. But in my view, there's kind of no way to actually get at transformation without starting to sort of reckon with that, and to sort of also then practice what it means to reconsider and to engage with practices which bring us into kind of another way of positioning that body and understanding the human experience in order to then construct a different kind of world to move forward in. So that all of that for me comes really down to sort of our actually these innate human capacities, this sensory and this human, the unification of the human sensorium, sort of from splitting that is sort of where we then get our kind of our different genres of art and sort of our fields of specialization. And certainly that's developed our culture in a lot of incredible ways, but also at what cost, and sort of what happens when we kind of deconstruct the body and the senses in that way. And how is it that we work towards sort of a more embedded sense of who we are as humans and our intertwinedness with all other things. And that needs to be something that's not like metaphorical, and that's not something like that sounds kind of groovy. It's concrete, but we nonetheless then need to figure out how to kind of build up our systems of education, our systems of governance, to sort of encapsulate all that spills over from the human experience, which is not acknowledged when we deny or negate the body, the bodilyness, and the phenomenon of being embodied. So for me, like all of these things of like the bodily, the sensory, even pleasure, all of these things are actually extremely political. It's only that we've kind of strangely relegated all things that deal with the body to this sort of non-space of like an inactive, sort of non-speaking and not able to speak space. Which for me is like hugely problematic, and maybe one of the foundational issues that, like, to me, I'm eager to sort of like work on in every way that I can.
I think another thing that came out, aside from the kind of very resonant, yes, absolutely, it's got kind of political energy and necessity, even from your comments. Another word that really stuck with me of what you've just said has to do with not just understanding or thinking, but practicing. And so that also what I would pull out in terms of like practical advice also has to do with like developing a bodily and sensorial relationship with our kind of more than human and maybe non-anthropocentric position necessitates the body to also take a little bit of that role or do that work at the same time as mind.
Yes, totally. And I think that interestingly, in Eduardo Cohen's book, And How Forests Think, I love his point about sort of maybe the mistake we make when we're sort of thinking about communication with other species or something, is kind of thinking that the basis of communication, or that the semiotics itself, is actually language. And sort of that's maybe the mistake there that makes it difficult for us, or what kind of throws us back into our anthropocentric habits, is rather, I like how he posits that basically life itself is a semiotic process, a process of relation, of response, and that is actually what constitutes life itself. So therefore, if we kind of stop sort of privileging the idea of language as a kind of only, or let's say semiotics as an only human communicational space, and sort of understand language itself, human language, as sort of a kind of outgrowth and evolution on that sort of nested within these other forms of these kind of other semiotic forms, then it becomes very possible sort of to sort of think about concrete sort of ways that we're actually communicating that can maybe open us towards, to kind of lead us out of the anthropocentric sort of habits of being that we tend to inhabit.
One of the things that I really loved about that book is exactly what you're saying of, but what happens when you start to think of, say, human communication or semiotics as an emergence from pre-existing in some way, like larger sense or semiotic or making. It also comes with a kind of humility of feeling like a greater development of humility, of feeling more like children of a larger thing. And I keep thinking about, I keep trying to figure out why it is so much more easy for, let's say, urbanized Western societies to consider the possibility of an eventual artificial intelligence acquiring consciousness than it is for the very same kind of cultures and society to acknowledge that there already is a consciousness in, say, that plant.
That's such a good question.
And you speak to people who work in technology, and most of the people that are at least a little bit not, slogan-based, they will say artificial consciousness is currently non-existent.
Right.
And I keep thinking about this, and I mean, in a very simple way, I started to think that it's much because of the fact that we emerge out of a world, and in fact, a parent, we emerge out of a parent. It is much easier to think of our creations, like our kids, as, I mean, all of this metaphorical, but also very real. Our kids as having like a full understanding and seeing the kind of full complexity of our children than our elders. And so the fact that, because we emerge out of them, and so the fact that like wisdom traditions have even just the position of the elder is one that is incredibly important, as opposed to the kind of youth culture and celebration of youth and novelty that exists, is like has something to do with this like emerging out of plants. I don't know how to.
Absolutely. I mean, it's so kind of interesting and deep also what you're saying. I feel like that you bring up this notion of like humility in this word is like, so to me also so powerful in that sense, because there's no space for that in today's culture. It seems it's so not a feature of our current sort of day to day. And sort of it makes me think of like other cultures, other historical periods where maybe there are different ways of displaying humility, and certainly those are active in other cultures and in other parts of the world. But I would say that like in my day-to-day experience, it's really quite the opposite, even to the extreme, in the sense of how the ways in which sort of social media operates in order to sort of that anyone can be a star with the number of followers, hits, etc. It's just sort of embedded in this, again, to bring up the kind of the culture of the quantifiable and of the visual. Perhaps these things are somehow linked together, and a necessity in a kind of consumer culture to generate the new and to be focused on the new as an object of desire, as something of that you want sort of proximity to. And then there's just there's all that sort of gets missed inside of that very narrow focus, a very fleeting focus.
So here's the kind of million, I don't know, million, not dollars, flowers, million flower question. It's given the fact that probably the educational policy and cultural frameworks that we are talking about being in dire need of transformation emerge out of a vision of the body, the self, the individual, the world, everything, that those transformations themselves would start to undo. How would one even begin that process? Like where are actually, this is maybe a more interesting more productive question. There's the notion of like what you call, there's a word that NGOs use to see like places in which there's particular, I mean, for better or worse NGOs, but like places in which there's particular success given the circumstances. Mm-hmm. And so like, where are those little fires of interesting transformative?
Yeah, great question. I myself I'm searching for them, and I'm trying to generate them in my own life and in my artistic practice. But I see that there are, when I'm kind of reaching out, I start to see that there really are crossovers, departments which start to be called like sensory studies. Mm-hmm. I start to see this popping up in kind of different ways, and in my own, how I envision my studio here is, I call it, it's sort of a fictional institute, what I call the Institute for Embodied Creative Practices. Like for me, this is something that emerges out of my artistic practice, but it's not really concerned with art as much as it is with practice, like hosting and holding space for generating methodologies around embodied practice. And I think that I think there's so many ways and forms of doing this. And I kind of think it would be interesting to kind of go like sort of across all fields and introduce these kind of methodologies, because it could definitely happen from an arena of sports. It could come from dance. It could come from meditation, spiritual practice. But it's sort of what it requires, or like in my mind, I see it as a checking in, is sort of like a taking in the phenomenon of what it means to be in a body, and starting to actually develop discourse and methodology around activating it in communion sort of with the world that we share with all things and all living beings, and sort of being able to have an ease or a literacy around embodiment, I think would be the thing to develop like curriculum and like modes of thought and ways of speaking about it. The pockets, I mean, I somehow think that they really are around, and even coming from places like from the sciences itself, and sort of how when I start to look into this a book I'm reading now called Impressionable Biologies. Full title is From the Archaeology of Plasticity to the Sociology of Epigenetics. Wow. So sort of where we're even looking at the, from the field of science and sociology, like coming into looking at the porosity basically of the body as it's understood now, because certainly there have been discourses from ancient Greek medicine, to humoralists, as I was mentioning before, about this kind of impressionable body, but with the kind of DNA code comes this kind of idea, this kind of concrete, that we can be reduced down to this strand of information. But what's becoming very clear in the sciences is that this is also subject to change depending on trauma, experience, environmental factors, and that these things can not only change the genetic code, but also be passed down through generations. So I see that somehow it's seeping into different kinds of kind of like highly focused investigations, whether it's coming from kind of cultural field or scientific field, that this space, I mean, there's just so much that spills over from our lived experience, and how do we account for that spillover of experience? And I see that there are, from different fields, kind of attempts to account for that in different ways. And I see that as like an exciting development when I see it I'm seeing it, especially in like academic fields. I think it would be very interesting to find ways to kind of bring that into day-to-day practice, into something that could become, sort of a mainstream understandings of how we approach reality, and how we approach our engagements with other living things and our ecologies.
too practical. It's so funny. I can visualize the kind of cheesy overlays on YouTube that go like, ding, advice number 3. But two things that emerged out of this that I heard definitely are, you need you need like artistic fields or fields that belong to the realm of the qualitative embedded in those institutions and those places. But then the other thing that I heard that I think is super interesting is like follow the thread all the way through. Like once things are there, you don't just get to the point where you're mindful enough to be able to be more productive. But when you bring that energy into an organization, from the mindfulness comes like humility in relation to a more than human world, and respect and kind of acknowledgement of the vastness and richness and depth of environmental kind of care in, say, indigenous wisdom traditions. And then from that take the step further, which has to do with like the actual political realities within which indigenous nations and peoples are at the moment, and ways of getting involved. And that leads you like, and just follow the thread all the way through.
Yes.
And then like back into kind of how you can then use that and take that into a methodology to kind of transform your own institution or organizational, which seems to me like a very possibly productive way out of this. You know, you've got the people who meditate over here and the people who protest over here. And there's sort of some kind of disagreement of or lack of kinds of things.
Right. Yes, I think it's I like the following the thread all the way through is a very exciting kind of notions. It sort of makes it feel like concrete somehow. And but what I get out of it too is that yes, like the humans being how we are, and with our capacity for our symbolic and abstract thinking, it's like the ways that we think absolutely shape our attitudes and our ways of being. And so if from whatever, you know, I feel like it can go, if we already acknowledge like the thought process itself as a kind of embodied phenomenon, and we continue following that through into finding ways that are, or finding practices which are somehow life fulfilling is what's coming to mind. And this word flourishing, in terms that I think you and I have talked about before, and maybe you were asking me sort of how do I understand this term flourishing. And I think there's a couple of, I think there's a couple of ways. I think I myself am in the process of trying to understand what it would mean to flourish, and what that means. I mean, we can look to sort of biology and sort of see and understand when like an ecological system is flourishing. It's harder for us to kind of, I think it's harder for us, and I'm going to say me, to understand what that means as a human, and that shouldn't be the case. I feel like I'm wrongly educated, therefore, you know, and I feel like why, like, but somehow, yes, maybe in our time we need to re-educate ourselves to figure out how to flourish as a species the way that other species kind of seem to move about their practice of living, or like their way of being in the world, in like towards their flourishing. To me, there's something about, one way of looking at it, of course, is kind of through these like moralistic lens, or this idea of sort of virtue, fulfillment, or something. But I think that there is some other way, that sort of, what is it that brings us into sort of fully being, and not alienated being, or kind of disembodied being, but rather like fully, to me, sort of fully embodied being would be a kind of that cognizant, awake awareness to the ways in which we are not individuals, to the ways in which we are embedded, and then how that's the sensibility that comes out of that might generate different kinds of action in terms of how, you know, how we move through the world, how we organize ourselves in the world, and how we operate.
Learning how to die is also very, or learning that death is a process of material transformation and retransformation of oneself into the elements that constitute ourselves and the planet and that we have in common is something that is completely disavowed by most sort of urban nights in today, and those morning rituals and practices that sort of invite that, not so much as a process of grief, but as a process of circularity or of creating those returns. I can't remember if Eduardo Conte speaks about it, and I have a feeling that he speaks about morning rituals. So it's almost like with flourishing comes also a sense of wilting, I guess.
Yes. I guess it seems like maybe if we're looking at it from now thinking of Eduardo Kohn, I think he very much does talk about sort of death, not only our let's say our death in our immediate sort of lifetime, but death of those before us, which kind of makes our being possible. So it's sort of, it actually becomes something that's completely not, they are one, like the sort of the life and death then process in that sense are they constitute somehow one another. And I think that is a very sort of deep and profound lesson that I think I've only started to sort of touch on in my own practice. Sort of one of my collaborators of a past project was a death doula, and kind of myself asking this same question and realizing I have no conceptual tools with which to handle the notion of death. I didn't inherit them from my culture or from my family. I haven't had it too close to me in my own experience. It's sort of not only conceptual tools, but sort of beyond that sort of a kind, like the world view that I have doesn't account for it very much. It's sort of there but hidden. The idea of death is sort of there but never sort of addressed. So I think that is really would very much I think be a part of this sensory approach, something that's beyond the abstract thought or concept of that into really a more deep understanding and grounded understanding of, as you say, sort of material transformation. Yeah.
It's very weird how, I mean, aside from the fact that, the body's then encased, you die and then the body's encased in a box so that literally the material that constitutes your body cannot mix with the material that constitutes the world. There are laws and regulations that determine what you do with ashes, for God's sake. So even in the case of cremation, you cannot. I remember when my grandmother died, we divided the ashes amongst two people, which felt kind of weird and funny at the time. But this idea that it was kind of illegal to do that you somehow have to keep even the ashes in the same, as though you could preserve this notion of the individual, and that you certainly can't spread them in nature because who knows why. It's like, so it has, when you start to see it after, say, an hour of speaking about anthropocentric standpoints, it just has something so Sisyphean and absurd and ridiculous to it.
Absolutely. And for all the kind of pride and the rationality of Western thought, it does sound extremely, totally irrational and ridiculous, such a practice at a certain point. Yes. Yes, I guess, like, also, I guess what comes in that, I suppose, this linearity of time, or this idea of time as it's just this one directional thing, is maybe the thing that's being preserved or something when we're kind of trying to avoid this idea of sort of death and transformation. And already again, sort of back to that sort of, what are the ideological framework on which we sort of build our experience of life. It's like, unitized, unidirectional time is maybe not a useful concept for us anymore.
Absolutely true, and probably a good place to conclude, even though it should start again from the beginning, but in a slightly different way, if we are to follow this logic.
Exactly.
This was so beautiful. And aside, very quickly, I completely forgot that we were recording. So it's just always such a joy and a pleasure to speak with you, Isabel. I'm incredibly grateful.
Same here. Thanks for making the time. It was great to be able to connect again, and I look forward to continuing this conversation.
Absolutely. Have a wonderful rest of your day.